Hello. All right. So once again, I'll get your names down. Are there any questions so far? Maybe if you had a chance to take a look at the handout. All right. So what I want to do is I want to share the screen and jump right into it, okay? So the first one is court history, all right, because it adheres to American exceptionalism, that America is special, is a special country, and that would number one, that it's a special country of opportunity, of unique opportunities. So you look at changes that were brought about in England itself, with Parliament becoming stronger and making demands upon the kings and queens of England of the Stuart line to give more concessions in economics and more of a say to the people from the House of Commons. And so that carried over to the Americas, in particular with the issuing of joint stock companies and the ability for private individuals of England to enrich themselves in America, in the frontier of North America. All right, and so you see that change brought about in England, and which supposedly had a beneficial effect upon the future United States and the English colonies. And then you also have the fact with indentured servants, you have the example of being able to become an adventurer. With an adventurer, right, or a settler, you could be treated as if you had paid money into the joint stock company if you were willing to come here, risk your life, travel 3,000 miles across the Atlantic, and risk your life in contending with Native Americans, contending with the elements, and trying to find and extract some source of wealth, some sort of commodity. Of course, they were hoping they would get lucky like the Spanish and find gold and silver, as the Spanish did in Bolivia and Peru and Mexico, etc. And that didn't happen. And so what they ended up, it seems as if by imperial decree, parliamentary laws, and just by the economic facts, they turned to cash crop farming in the South as the primary revenue source. That is mainly tobacco. Tobacco was a huge, and that's what's funny, right? Is in the early modern period of the 15 and 1600s, non-essentials like chocolate, coffee, tea, tobacco were huge, huge money makers. The sugar producing Caribbean made more money than North America did entirely. For quite some time in the early modern period, just off that one cash crop alone. So at any rate, if you came here and you helped facilitate that, and you were willing to take a chance, you didn't have to have any capital. You didn't have to have a noble name or a noble bloodline. It was free for any Englishman to come and try to take advantage of. But of course, with English common law and the laws of coverture, etc., not so much for women, but predominantly for white English men who were entitled to citizenship by way of bloodline through their parents and or by nationality, being born in the English realms. Those are the two broad categories for citizenship and the rights that were entailed with citizenship that were progressively being given by Parliament and by the kings and queens of England. So you had that opportunity. You could become an indentured servant. And I like an indentured servant to perhaps, someone today engaging in a menial job, a job that entails hard work, does not pay well, doesn't seem to have much of a future opportunity for advancement. But that young man or woman is going to school, is going to college, taking night classes or a couple classes a semester. So you have a mind, right? Your expectation is you're not going to stay there at that menial job. You have something higher up the socioeconomic ladder that you're aspiring to. And that's what it was for indentured servants. It was the hope that you would serve as a servant farmer for 3 to 7 years for someone else. But when you were done, you were given freedom dues. And that entailed, it was supposed to entail not only supplies, not only a skill that you were to have learned and be able to practice once you were done with your service, but also even land. And there were people like George Alsop and others in Maryland in particular that really set forth, almost propaganda about how wonderful of a thing it was to become an indentured servant and rise up thereafter. But then you have another book in Major Problems in American History, another source, people like Richard Frethorn. And Frethorn, his was a very, very sad case, couldn't escape the misery of his condition. So it's arguable. As far as percentages, it's difficult. But Virginia developed a very negative reputation for the odds that were in the favor of the indentured servants, and Maryland developed quite a reputable, a good reputation for success rates amongst ex-indentured servants. So you had that opportunity as well. But at the same time, right, if you were wealthy and you brought over laborers, you could receive 50 to 100 acres of free land for each laborer that you brought. And why was that? Because supposedly they were desperate for labor. They were labor scarce and land rich. And that seemed to have been a good combination for Americans because when you're labor scarce, they're more apt to give better working conditions, if not better working conditions, better pay out of that desperation. And with greater access to land by way of squatters' rights through English common law, you could squat on land, trespass on land that was not your own, but was supposedly not being improved. And you can improve it, stay on it for a set number of years, and have it granted to you by squatters' rights. So there were opportunities here, but nevertheless, if you were wealthy, there were even greater opportunities. So hence capitalism for better and for worse, in that it opened up relative to England, relative to Europe in the early modern era of the 1600s. It opened up more opportunities, arguably, for white English men, but it still favored the wealthy, and such as through systems like the headright system. And not to mention, they established an aristocracy here in the South, in particular, the English did, that went from that carried back to England itself. Oftentimes they were the second or beyond that, those other than the eldest sons, because under primogeniture, the oldest English son received all the lands and titles from dad back in England. So you had all the different marks of, a duke, an earl, a marquis, etc. And those were carried over here to the present day United States. So it was still better, still easier materialistically to be wealthy, and you had more opportunities. All right. So any questions on number one, what I intended to have conveyed? And feel free to disagree with these, okay? Then numbers 2 and 3 are in kind of binary opposition to each other. Number 2, as you see here, Virginia is from the Native American perspective. And you're going to see a perspective of the English as being very deceitful, very ungrateful, very greedy, and even violent. All right, so look for evidence of that. I mean, look at here at the beginning. It says that before that they grow discontented with your habitation, plant an invulnerable facade and deal with your own firstly. That is hardly the makings of some type of, cultural fusion, whereby the English may want to come and coexist with Native Americans, intermarry with them, borrow from one another culturally and institutionally. That doesn't seem to have been the intention at all, right? But saying, right, that, okay, when the Native Americans realize that you're there to stay, they're obviously not going to be happy with that. So right off the bat, build yourself a fort, make it seem invulnerable, right? Do not under any circumstances sell firearms to the Native Americans. Keep a monopoly on that weapon, right, on gunpowder, and take care of your own first. So it kind of paints a picture of the ugly English imperialist who comes in, is going to take what he wants, doesn't care that he likely knows, right, from these instructions that the Native Americans are not going to take kindly to his coming to stay permanently on the North American continent, but he doesn't care. He doesn't care, and he's out for himself. He's out for his own, his fellow Englishmen. And then it follows from there, and you see examples of John Smith and the men at Jamestown, the 105 men that initially came, coming in, taking what they wanted, engaging in extortion, right? Threatening violence upon Native American tribes that didn't trade corn to them when they got desperate for food, and going back on their word and promising Powhatan, the king of a about 12 tribe confederation in present day Virginia of Native Americans, famous Pocahontas' father, promises made to him that were never made good. And then you see this mighty Powhatan who had the opportunity to wipe them out for arguably the first 5 years, from about 1607 to at least to 1610, when the Powhatan War, the first Powhatan War erupted. Prior to that, at least in the first few years, he arguably could have done so, according to historian Helen Roundtree, but he didn't. It wasn't in his nature, supposedly, but also he was a tactician, and he wanted that firepower that the English had. He wanted to had kind of a wait and see type of MO that he followed. And of course, in hindsight, he may have wanted to have wiped them out for the sake of his tribal's success and survival itself. But of course, hindsight is 2020, right? It's easy to see after the fact what you did wrong. So at any rate, the term agency is certain minority demographics, right? Like Native Americans today. The argument is they don't want to be depicted just simply as victims of circumstances, victims of the mistreatment of Euro-Americans and Europeans coming here. But instead, right, they want to show where they made decisions that matter, even if they made decisions that were poor in hindsight, that were detrimental to their own livelihood, to their own survival and success. They still had the ball in their court, proverbially, and made decisions that mattered. So that's important to remember with number 2, all right, with Powhatan and the Confederation putting up with these Englishmen, perhaps for too long, to their own detriment. And then number 3 is old school, very politically incorrect thesis by David Price. And he actually defends the English, and defends in particular and extols, pretty much praises John Smith, their leader. And because John Smith, when he came in, he initially was not a leader because he didn't have noble titles, and he wasn't a major contributor to the joint stock company because he didn't have the wealth to be a major contributor. And so at any rate, he became kind of an extra legal, beyond the books, beyond the official institution of the council and the governor. He became the informal leader. And how is that? Is notice that there's evidence to suggest that the Native Americans were not always meek sheep, as Las Casas had depicted them, but they were too capable of deceit, treachery, violence, power grabs, etc. So look for that. Like I said, to me, I mean, just the guts of this writer, just to have written this, because it's so politically incorrect. But I wanted you to get both sides of the issue. And so look and see for this, and by all means, tear into it if you like. But that's what you get here. And he praises John Smith for his sagacity. And remember, with sagacity, it's like street smarts. It's your worldly wisdom with how people interact, how to make shrewd, practical, day-to-day, and integral, important decisions in life without necessarily a formal education or learning. And so look at that, and look at this supposedly sagacious John Smith and how he gets the English, the very somewhat pitiful, precarious, vulnerable English settlement at Jamestown to survive. And that's the famous painting of him about to supposedly be beaten to death by Powhatan's warriors, and Pocahontas intercedes on his behalf. He's the only person, the only Euro-American there. He's the only written source, primary source of this story. So we'll probably never know how, to what extreme there was any truth to that story. But you had a couple others. You had a guy named Strachey. I think it was William Strachey, and about 3 other Englishmen who kept journals and writings, and they also are primary sources besides John Smith. And thank goodness, because John Smith, to some people, had a penchant for boasting and making himself look good in his writings. Then slavery. Remember, you guys, some of these that I put together kind of tongue-in-cheek, right? With a grin on my face, thinking, I don't even really believe in what I'm putting here. So keep that in mind, okay? There's certainly another side to this coin. But I went ahead, and because I thought it was thought-provoking, and it seems to have been the thesis of the last couple books I've read on slavery, and that is that slavery was an economic and not a racist decision. So as you might guess, if you have yet to read it, it's going to delve into demographic, economic realities, right? And try to, those are the facts that they're going to select and interpret and present, right? And they're going to kind of steer away from evidence of blatant racism. So look for that here in this one. So you have an alternative source of labor, poor white English men and women. You're going to see on this section evidence for that source waning in numbers, right? Diminishing in numbers, and also waning in trust and public trust in that labor source, as they especially developed a bad reputation during Bacon's Rebellion. Take a look at Bacon's Rebellion and what that entailed. I believe I have a question on the test on Bacon's Rebellion, but it's a real kind of poor versus the wealthy fight. The Western peripheral ex-indentured servants under a well-to-do leader, perhaps demagogue, manipulator of the people, Nathaniel Bacon, against the system itself, against the colonial government of the coast in the Tidewater region of Virginia. So that happens. And then look for statistics on African Americans, on Africans, right? Becoming more plentiful and more affordable in this section, all right? More plentiful in number, and their prices plummeting, okay? So look for evidence of that. Looking for things going on in Africa itself, as well as in Europe and in America, that might heighten the demand for these African slaves, and the timing working out well, especially in the mid to late 1600s. All right, so you see evidence of that. But notice, right, this section doesn't completely turn a blind eye to the contrary argument. So you see here, right? Indubitably, a history of racist sentiment can be traced long before the arrival of slaves. But popular racist sentiment cannot be traced to a handful of written works that were read by very few Euro-Americans. And then also up here, let's see here, there's somewhere. But also look at the stigmatization of African Americans and how convenient that stigmatizing was. For instance, of them being more hardy, more physically strong, and can endure physical hardship and labor, and can overcome disease more effectively and more strongly than could Native Americans and poor white indentured servant laborers. Look for evidence of course, contending that they were savage and uncivilized, and so hence it was more pardonable to enslave them because of the way in which they lived and the manner of their culture and collective behavior back in Africa, and negative depictions of that. All right, so look at all of that. But notice that in this number, it's all tied supposedly to economics. And that is a very arguable point. There are definitely some key historians and academics, etc., who would beg to differ with this number. But I found what was interesting is Ibram Kendi. This guy is very well known presently as an African-American historian. And as much as he focuses upon in his books racism and the role of racism, right? In this section, it's depicted, and this is arguable, okay, but it's depicted that even Ibram Kendi, in his depiction of racism, at least in his book called Stamped from the Beginning by Ibram Kendi, that even in his book, it contends supposedly that those who stigmatized the African people oftentimes had an ulterior economic motive and a desire to justify enslaving them and enrich themselves off of enslaving them. All right. So again, very arguable. Number 5, African American agency in early South Carolina. South Carolina is going to subsequently, after its joint stock company rule, is going to be known as one of the most backward, archaic, inequitable, economically unfair, imbalanced, oppressive, racist states in the entire country and in the South. But before then, when it was owned by a joint stock company, right, there was a brief window of time in which African Americans took advantage of a desperate need for their labor, and they diplomatically demanded rights and opportunities, and they received, in many cases, those rights and those opportunities. So clearly this is a case of agency, again, of African Americans, that they were not just victims, but they could dictate their own future. They could help dictate the future of the United States, okay? And so hence they had a say in what happened as well. And they did well for themselves in negotiating better circumstances, sometimes freedom, sometimes money to eventually buy freedom, sometimes limited freedom, etc. So take a look at instances in which their labor was direly needed, and take a look and see what they received for doing that labor. Of course, by their initiative. Oh, you need my help? Well, what's in it for me? Right? And to historians, that is a great case of agency. And number 6, the title says it all, right? Of course, slave conditions were awful. Believe it or not, Fogel and Ingerman wrote a book called Time on the Cross, in which they contended that materially, physically, right? They didn't have the nerve to say psychologically or emotionally, right? But at least physically, that slaves' lives were not that bad, were not that tough, because they were expensive investments. And they wanted, the slave masters, the planters, wanted to see their investments yield high labor productivity. So I hate to liken it to this, but like if you buy a horse, because under English common law, coming from Rome, matter of fact, I'm not even sure if it came from Rome. I don't know to what extent it was Germanic and to what extent it was Roman, because those are the two sources of English law. But the English, with their common law, they contended that slaves were chattel. They were agricultural property on paper. So hence, if you pay a lot of money for a horse, you're going to want to feed the horse well. You're going to want to tend to the horse's wounds and illnesses, so that for no other reason, not out of humanitarianism, but in order to get the best out of your horse, the best productivity. That was their thesis. This section says, I don't think so, right? And contends there is way too much evidence to suggest that slaves' lives were not just emotionally and psychologically, but were also physically awful. So instead of just being very overt in the support of evidence, right? I would say an example of overt evidence would be evidence of whipping, right? That's hard to come by. I've read some pretty well-respected historians on slavery, and I don't get very, I can't seem to glean that hard data well, virtually anywhere. So instead of doing something that blatant, right, the supportive evidence is more indirect and states, look at evidence of slave rebellion, of slaves absconding, right, leaving with property, running away, basically of slave discontent. Look at evidence of primary sources of the madams of the homes, the wives of the planters, right? And then there is some evidence of physical brutality that is used in this section as well. Again, as you see it here on the title, Native American agency with the French. Look for evidence. This doesn't happen very often. Look for evidence of the Native Americans manipulating and bullying the Euro-Americans, in this case, the French, up and down the Mississippi River. Because remember, in historiography, you kind of go from court history, which praises the Euro-Americans and kind of vilifies the Native Americans, then to kind of post-World War II, post-civil rights historiography that depicts the Native Americans as helpless victims and kind of, intends to elicit our compassion in conflict history fashion of winners and losers, and the winners are the bad guys, right? Then to agency that states, no, the Native Americans made decisions that mattered. They had power at one time and they exercised it. And even if they did abuse that power, and mistreat the Euro-Americans, in this case, the French, then so be it. Because it still highlights their agency. Okay. And then number 8 is a little bit like number 1. French Louisiana in the South, fluid by accident. And by fluid, I mean institutionally and culturally open to, amenable to people rising up and down the socioeconomic pyramid or ladder. Because remember, in the early modern period, their rhetoric, their institutions were not egalitarian, putting everyone on equal footing, like we're accustomed to today. No one any more special than anybody else. No rights, opportunities, privileges ought to be given to one demographic and not others as well, right? That was just simply not the case in the early modern period. It was much more hierarchical, right, with a set hierarchy of classes, and it was much more static, that you were more likely to remain for your entire lifetime in whatever socioeconomic position you were born into. You were likely to stay. So this was seen as an anomaly out of something out of the ordinary, that French Louisiana, that the authorities tried to recreate static, hierarchical France here in Louisiana. They call it cultural baggage, where you take your way of doing things, your institutions of school, family, government, and you try to replicate those as if you're living in your home country still. And you try to plant that home plant, if you will, that home flower on American soil. Well, the argument here is that the French plant did not grow well in American soil, despite the efforts of the governing authorities of French Louisiana, who wanted it to. They were short on men. They were short on supplies and resources. They were short on women. And in their desperation, they grudgingly allowed more opportunities for more people than they had initially ever intended. So it was simply circumstantial, right? As to why and how opportunities for more people developed, opened up in French Louisiana than existed back in France proper. Fluid by accident. All right, are there any questions? Did I go too quickly? Would you like me to return to any of the numbers and elaborate more? Can I get any thumbs up as far as, feeling relatively better about this assignment, having sat through my lecture? Thank you, Angelica. All right, thank you, Jamal. All right. All right, good. That makes me feel better. If I can help you at all, I'm happy to. So any questions at all?
A question about our book. I know the bookstore doesn't have it listed still.
It doesn't. I'm very sorry. I've sent them 2 emails and they've yet to respond to me. I just took too long. I just simply took too long. And so, I mean, the good news is for one, in purchasing or renting a used copy online, you could get it much cheaper than it would have cost regularly in the bookstore. And also on the good side is I try to maximize the amount of time that passes before you really need it. I try to push that off as well as I can. But the bad news is if you had some type of voucher to help you receive it at a discounted price or even for free, I'm very, very sorry.
Okay. I had another question about the test one that the document you provided us.
Sure,
That
sure.
is that the actual test?
That is, yes, sir. Yeah, and I will include shortly, in the next day or two, I will include the questions of the Southern on this topic that we're doing this week as well. The questions that you'll find on test one from this topic as well.
Okay. Thank you.
You're very welcome. All right, anyone else? I'm glad you asked those questions though, Savan. Is that, I'm sure that helped at least someone else. Okay. Go ahead. Savan, we can't hear you. Are you okay? Maybe he didn't mean to unmute. All right, guys. So if there aren't any other questions, again, you have a phone number and you have the Canvas messages that I'll be happy to respond to. That's that. So remember, please read all of them. Please read the test questions that I'll post shortly. All right. And all you have to do is pick one to analyze and evaluate for this week, as usual. So good luck, okay?
I appreciate it. Thank you.
You're very welcome. Appreciate you guys coming here. Happy to give you extra credit for it.
I have another question, Professor.
Yes.
So last week's test, I did it, but do we have to turn it in? I didn't know that.
Oh, no, I'm very sorry, Kevin. I should have made that clear.
Yeah.
It's nothing for you to do yet.
Okay,
It's just simply, it literally will be the test. They're the questions, right, that are that you'll have on the test. So it's just a matter of preparing you so you know exactly what's coming.
Okay, so it's like a study guide.
Exactly. It's
Okay.
a thorough study guide.
Awesome. All right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No problem, Kevin. I'm glad you mentioned that. I probably need to elaborate upon that in an announcement that they're not an assignment. There's nothing at the moment during this week to do, but simply look over them and prepare for the test.
Okay. Thank you.
No, thank you for that question. All right. So anybody else? All right. Well, I hope I helped. Yes? I hope I helped, and you guys have a great week, okay? Happy to do this. I wish I could see you in person.